Final topic in cell respiration is actually going to be the anaerobic cell respiration. So we're going to go through a little video that talks about some types of anaerobic respiration. Recall that anaerobic respiration refers to any type of respiration that does not utilize oxygen. We learned in the last video that oxygen is used as an electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. So once we go through anaerobic respiration, we'll kind of just do a big comparison of all the energy that we've made in aerobic versus anaerobic. So there are two types of anaerobic respiration, and you see that this word fermentation is used. That's kind of a synonym for anaerobic respiration. It might be more familiar to you. There are two types, alcoholic and lactic acid. Notice that both start with glycolysis. So this is the same process we learned about back in the beginning before aerobic respiration. It's in a much more consolidated fashion though. We have 6 carbons for our C6H12O6, so it starts with glucose. And notice that it's been consolidated to show that we need 2 ATP going into this process, and what will come out is 2 ADP. And then as a byproduct in the whole transition from glucose down to the 2 pyruvic acids or 2 pyruvates, you're going to get 4 ATP produced for a net gain of 2. Along that process, we are going to remove high energy electrons, and we're going to produce this NADH. So this molecule, NADH, has been reduced. It gained those electrons that were embedded within the molecules that transition between glucose to pyruvic acid. Now from here, an organism that doesn't have oxygen present or doesn't utilize it at all is going to go through alcoholic fermentation possibly. So one such organism might be yeast. That's an example of an anaerobic organism. And it would be facultative anaerobe because it lives in an oxygen environment, but it doesn't utilize it. So the 2 pyruvic acids, they're not going to draw both of them, so they just identify that there's 2 of these. They're going to go through a quick transition from a 3-carbon molecule to a 2-carbon molecule. So that means that we're going to lose, so here's an arrow signifying that each of the pyruvic acids is going to lose 1 carbon dioxide for a total of 2. We're going to avoid this. I don't need to kind of bog you down with that detail about water. But what we form is a molecule that has an aldehyde attached to it. If you recall from chapter 3, just as a little review, aldehydes were part of the carbonyl group, and they have a double bonded oxygen on an N carbon. And since there's only 2 carbons here, both of them have to be an N, so there would be no ability for it to be its close, somewhat common grouping, which would have been the ketone. So this is an aldehyde, part of the carbonyl group. And so what will now happen is the electron that was just removed all the way up here, there's that high energy electron, it's going to flow down, and that electron and its hydrogen is going to then be incorporated at this step. Once that has been dropped off, it's like taking the electron from here to here. Now we form NAD+, that's the oxidized version, and that will then go right back up into glycolysis to get recharged. So what's the point of this? There's no ATP produced down here, but what would happen if all you had was this step? The analogy would be that you have an empty car. This is the car with the electron in it, or a passenger. If you never had the ability for this electron to be dropped off, you would eventually run out of empty vehicles, and that would then stop this whole process. You need to constantly regenerate this oxidized version so that more and more electrons can be removed during glycolysis. So this NADH is just dropping off the electrons, so now it's an empty vehicle once again, so it can just cycle through. So the bottom portion of this formation of ethanol is not really important for energy production. It's really important for just a place to drop off these high energy electrons. So now we have an ethanol. If you recall, ethanol is part of the hydroxyl group. It's got an OH. It's not signified here, but it is recognized that there are actually Eth is a prefix for 2. So that recognizes ethanol as being an alcohol. And in the process, you form, again, a big component of this is the making of oxygen. And if you know how yeast work, yeast is made or used to make bread. And what you do is bread is a carbohydrate, so think of like that, where the yeast is mixed with a carbohydrate, such as glucose. And so what will happen is the yeast is going to produce not only ethanol as a byproduct, but it produces CO2, which then makes the bread rise. So that's the whole reasoning behind that. And that's just one of the two types of anaerobic respirations we will talk about. The second is lactic acid fermentation, and this is what humans do. Once we are out of oxygen in our mitochondria, we still want to make, we still need to make energy, so we need to go through lactic acid fermentation. And some of you may recognize lactic acid because that's the, in long-term strenuous activities, you always hear that term, feel the burn, and that's what this whole process is going to make you feel. Glycolysis, same idea. I don't even need to go through it a third time. It's the same process from glucose to 2-pyruvates. This is an even simpler process. So what we do is we take that reduced version of NADH that was produced in glycolysis. It's going to go down here. I don't know why the arrow, it really should be reversed, so change that in your notes if you have those in there. The electrons and hydrogens from the NADH will be dropped off into this process, and then what will happen is the oxidized version of NAD+ will be formed, and just like the other fermentation, we'll go back up. But this does not lose any carbon dioxide. So we start with 3, we end with 3. So lactate or lactic acid is formed from this process. So there's no intermediate. It's pretty much from this diagram, a simple one-step process. All we need is the high energy electron that was removed up here. And that forms lactic acid. So in terms of energy, there is no ATP produced here or over here in ethanol formation. So let's compare the numbers here. We have aerobic versus anaerobic. So in aerobic respiration, we had glycolysis. And in glycolysis, we have a net gain of 2 ATP. And we look over here and we do anaerobic, and the same row would also give us a net gain of 2 ATP. But in glycolysis, with aerobic respiration, you also produce 2 NADH. And if you remember, what will happen is the NADH will go to the electron transport chain in aerobic respiration, and the currency is basically saying for every one of these, you get 3 ATP. So it's really saying we basically got 6 ATP. We do make NADH over here, but that doesn't go to an electron transport chain, so it never gets turned into ATP, so we can't count that in the energy production of ATP. Then we have the prep stage, where there is no gain of ATP, but what is more important is, once again, 2 NADHs are made, so once again, the possibility of 6 ATP is there. There is no prep stage, anaerobic respiration. This is all you get. We're done. There's no more production of ATP. Then we get the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle gave us 2 ATP, 6 NADH, which once again, if each one gives us 3, that's a possible 18 ATP, and then 2 FADH2. Which, if you remember the currency, they only give us 2 ATP for every one of those. If you need to go back, review the electron transport chain. So that's only 4 ATP. So if we add these all up, okay, so we have 2 plus 6, so we've got 8, 14, 14 plus 4, that's an easy 18, 18 times 2, so 36. Did I do that right? 36 ATP. Okay. Oh, sorry. The reason so this is 36. I forgot to add these 2 ATP. Sorry. So that does change it. Plus 2. So that's 38 ATP. So 38 ATP over an aerobic respiration versus only 2 in anaerobic respiration. So we can see that the amount of efficiency is not really that great. So there's a lot of wasted energy left over in an anaerobic respiration. But the organisms that do anaerobic respiration are not very large organisms. They don't need a lot of energy. So therefore, even though they waste a lot, they're not going to need that much energy. Whereas a eukaryotic organism that most often is going to go through aerobic respiration has a lot of energy needs. So therefore, you are going to need a lot of ATP and not waste a lot. Okay. So those are just, the ideas of comparing anaerobic respiration to aerobic respiration. All right.